which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have touched, the word of life.
When I was 13 years old, my oldest sister had just become a believer. The gospel had just been presented to her, and the power of Jesus Christ and what a personal relationship with Him can be. I asked her if she could lead me in the prayer, or what do I need to do? And she says, I don't know what to do. Let me take you to my pastor. So anyway, she ended up taking me to see her pastor, and he began to share with me the Romans Road. And he prayed with me to receive Christ, and that was at 13 years old. My search continued, and I really didn't get discipled the way that I would like to have, because if I'd have had someone really share with me, I was so hungry at the time, and I would have been just like a sponge. And so I began to flounder again, and then on 2 years of just really searching for love in all the wrong places. And at 15 years old, I found out I was pregnant. And that was very devastating to me. I was a sophomore in high school, and the hardest thing, I feel like I was ready to stand before God and ask for forgiveness before I wanted to go and tell my mother what I had done. This was in 1973, when Roe versus Wade had changed our laws on abortion, and now I could have legally gotten an abortion. But searching my own heart, and with my belief and knowing that Jesus still was a part of my life, even though I hadn't really been walking it, I realized this was not a decision that I could make. Well, I'm one of the fortunate ones. The father of my child said he loved me. He wanted to make a home for me. I couldn't marry him unless he got saved. I knew that I needed to make this a one flesh relationship, and to honor God like I wanted to. He needed to know the Lord. I couldn't marry him. We'd be unequally yoked, and I at that time was rededicating my life to the Lord. So I wanted him to get saved, but I didn't know how to tell him about it, and so I took him to my sister. He did make that dedication, not because he wanted to marry me. That's what I appreciated so much, because if he was going to do that, he'd have probably done it the first time. We got married, and it was not an easy marriage. I don't recommend getting married at 15 and 17, and it wasn't God's fault. I had placed my own self there, and so I just wanted to do the best I could, be a good mom, be a good wife. At that point, we kind of started to waver in our faith, and we were far enough away from the church that we'd been attending at the time to start letting, Sundays go by and not actually getting up and going to church. And I always say Christians a lot of times are like cars. They start missing before they finally quit. My husband started dabbling again in drugs. He'd grown up in that atmosphere as far as, his teenage years. And we were the only 18-year-olds who owned our own house. So it became like a party atmosphere. They were growing pot in our basement. I mean, it was just becoming more than what I could bear. I again started to backslide, and my husband and I actually separated twice during that first 7 years. And the last time I left him, I said, it's the third time, I said, if I leave you now, I will not come back. Anyway, so I did pack everything up that day, and I left absolutely with the intention of never returning. And so he was on the road a lot. Well, I had met a man during this time, and our separation, we'd been separated for about 4 months. I met a guy that, again, was starting to meet all of those needs for me emotionally. So I moved in with this guy. One night, I just really couldn't take it anymore. I finally had reached my bottom. Everybody's bottoms are different. When I kind of came around and started thinking clearly, I decided to reach out to a Christian friend. So when I called at 5 o'clock in the morning, she wasn't shocked. She wasn't mad at me for waking her up. I told her, I said, I've made a lot of mistakes, and I realized the biggest mistake I made is not following through in my walk with the Lord. I've been disobedient, and my question to you is, will God take me back? And she said, yes, he will. And so I prayed a prayer as simply as I could, through tears, on the phone, while she's on the other line, and the other end of the line, and she began to pray for me. And I just started to feel stronger in my spirit, and I just knew I was going to make it. Things were going to be okay. I made some phone calls. I called my mom first. I called her and I said, I don't want to live like this anymore. I really want to start over again. It's going to mean leaving my job here, basically, and I just want to know, can I come home? And you know how moms and dads are, they let you come home. And I remember as I was packing that I wish Jack would call. I wish he would call so that I could tell him that I'd rededicated my life to the Lord. As I was packing, I remember thinking, I wish he'd call. I just want to tell him what I've done. And not 10 minutes after I thought that thought, this is the power of God, the phone rang. He called specifically to tell me that he'd given his life back to the Lord. And so he said, can I come and see you? And I said, yeah, I'd like that. So his obedience was much the same as mine. At that point, we're realizing that we've got to be together. I just wanted to obey God. That was the only thing on my mind, just obey God. And God just continued to help me. Where God guides, God provides. So we got married again. Actually, we got remarried in a church service on a Sunday morning. And from that moment on, we began to work on our relationship. He is definitely a different man, and I am definitely a different woman. This is Caleb Patrick Wolf, and he is my grandson. And the reason I am so proud of him and wanted to show him off today is because his daddy was my crisis pregnancy.
Hello and welcome once again to the amazing collection. And we are in the second book of Kings, the sad book of the exile. Now I know that 2 Kings can be a confusing book, but I just want to break this down a little bit and remind you that just like 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings is the same book. It's just a continuation of the tragic and devastating story that you started to learn about last week. Some people have said to me, well, I either read 1 Kings and 2 Kings or 1 Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but I don't usually read them both. Please read them both. Please read them both. You get a much fuller picture if you take the time. Do this for yourself. 1st and 2nd Kings is from man's perspective. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is from God's perspective. 1st and 2nd Kings covers history. It's more historical. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is more spiritual. And 1st and 2nd Kings covers both of the divided nations. Remember the 2 crowns that Linda introduced us to. One is supposed to represent the lesser kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, and the other, the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. Chronicles only covers Judah and the building of the temple. So please, for your own sake, read this book. It is full of colorful stories. I promise it will keep you interested. Now, the other way we're going to break this down is the reminder that you're being dropped in the middle of an old-day novel. There are 3 stories that are already interwoven, intertwined, and through our divisions that we're using for this lecture, we're going to separate those for you. Hopefully, it'll make it simpler to think of it as division number 1 are the prophets. That's all we're going to look at. And those are from chapters 1 through 13. Then division number 2, we're just going to look at the kings of Israel who ignored God's warnings. And then in division number 3, we will look at the kings of Judah. Now, sadly, when these books open, they're being ruled by lesser than God's best. And by the time they close, these folks have all been taken into exile. But God didn't want that to happen. He didn't want that to happen. And when we start our first division, I want you to keep in mind, God gave the people warnings. He gave them prophets because He didn't want this to happen. He didn't want them to be exiled. He said, do not gather for yourself horses, which means prestige and power. Do not gather money, gold, silver, and do not gather wives, because they would come in and bring the idolatry with them. But they did it anyway. God was warning them because God never gives judgment. This is how merciful He is, without a warning. He never gives judgment without a warning. So during this time, the time of the kings, He gives the most powerful, influential men as prophets the world has ever known. To the northern kingdom, to Israel, He gives Jonah, Amos, and Hosea. He also gives Elijah and Elisha, who we will study today. To the southern kingdom, to Judah, He gives Nahum, Joel, Isaiah, Micah, Zechariah, Jeremiah, and a whole bunch of other guys whose names I can't pronounce. Because He loved the people so much. Because He wanted them to love Him back and to obey Him out of that love. Now, the two prophets we're going to study today, I will admit, can get confusing. When 1 Kings ended, we had Elijah, okay? J. And we're going to be introduced to Elisha, S-H. S-H comes after J. J comes first. These are two completely different guys that the Lord is using to woo the people back to Himself. And they're so different, I thought I'd go through it just quickly so you can get a picture of them. Elijah is the forerunner of John the Baptist. He wore wild clothes, camel suit with a leather cord for a belt. Elisha was from a wealthy family and was known to wear the robes of a teacher. Elijah had a wild hair and a mane. Elisha was bald, we find out in 2 Kings. Elijah lived in the wilderness. Elisha was a city boy and preferred the people. Elijah was a loner. He didn't even take a disciple until God told him to take Elisha as his disciple. Now, Elisha was a people person. He was known to have at least 100 prophets in training. He discipled men in the truth of God's word. Elijah was known to be bold, and then the next minute cowardly. Elisha was pretty even-tempered. We hardly ever even see him get angry in this text. Elijah was known as the prophet of fire. We might say fire and brimstone. Fire is associated with Elijah. Remember in 1 Kings, he called fire down to take on the prophets of Baal. Then in the opening of 2 Kings, he calls fire down from heaven to burn up some enemies that are attacking him. And then he ascends to heaven on a chariot of fire. Elisha we can think of more as a prophet of water. He actually has Nahum being baptized in the Jordan. He purifies a contaminated stew. He purifies contaminated water. They are as different as can be, and their ministries were completely different. Elisha's ministry was completely different than his mentors because he is the forerunner of Jesus Christ. You may have never thought about this, but Elijah and Elisha came in pairs, one before the other. One that John the Baptist is compared to. But Elisha is also supposed to remind us or refer us to Jesus the Christ. His ministry was about life, not death, and mercy and miracles. His life was about caring and compassion and taking care of the people. I'm going to read a few little things to you And I just mean, these are just some of the parallels I pulled from the text. You will have a bunch more, I assure you. So look for them carefully. But I just want to see what these who these remind you of. All right, Elisha spoke truth to the leaders and never ran from confrontation. Why? Because he knew that as the leader goes, so go the people. Who else never ran from confrontation and spoke truth to the people? Jesus. He cared for the poor. Elisha is the who God used, the prophet who God used to multiply the widow's oil. Who else cared for the poor? Jesus. He raised a child from the dead. Who else raised a child from the dead? And Lazarus as well. Jesus. He multiplied bread and had so much left over he could feed his disciples. Who else did that? Jesus. He was instructed by God. He told Naaman how to be healed from leprosy. Leprosy means death. No one in those days did anything for a leper. Elisha did. He showed mercy. He helped heal a leper. Who reached out, touched, and healed lepers? Jesus. He defied the elements. At one point, one of Elisha's disciples comes to him and he's distraught and says, I lost an axe head that I borrowed in the water. Well, that thing weighs a ton. It's clearly at the bottom of the lake. But Elisha, God empowers him to raise that axe head and it floats on the water. Who else defied the elements? Who else spoke peace to the sea? Jesus. Who else changed water into wine? Jesus. Who walked upon the elements of water? Jesus. He also did miracles with sight. He would open and close eyes of people he came in contact with. One story you'll love, he opens the eyes of his servant so that he can see chariots of fire. He can see God's army ready to protect him from an enemy army. And then he closes the eyes of the enemy. Who else could open eyes and give sight? Jesus. Elisha could have called down that army, those chariots of fire, to wipe out this earthly army, but he didn't do it. Who else could have called down 12 legions of angels and wiped out the Roman guard in Gethsemane? Jesus. Even in Elisha's death, he brought life to another body. Who brings life through his death? Jesus. Elisha's ministry lasted 50 years. God was so good to his people to use him that way with gentleness and love. Why do you think he did that? Because he wanted them to see his power worked out through Elijah, who had asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. I think God answered that prayer because Elisha emulated that power. And it was also to show his love. Now there was judgment in Elisha's ministry. We read about him rebuking some teenagers that called him bald-headed. And they did. They said, you go on up, bald-headed. You go on up with Elijah. And he had a bear come out and maul him. He did. And a servant that was disobedient and caught in a lie, he cursed him. And the fellow had Naaman's leprosy on his family for generations. Now, why would he do that? Because he was allowing him to be a just judge of the time. He was representing God, and God will not be mocked. He had given a warning, and they had ignored it. And if you don't hear anything else here today, hear this. God will eventually judge and discipline his children. God will eventually punish his subjects if they continue to ignore his warnings. And we see that in the prophets of these times. Now, a whole kingdom of folks that did that were living in Israel at the time. And you know this had to break God's heart. The northern kingdom, which we'll use this crown for, I don't know if you guys can see this, but there are little bitty turkeys all over this crown. And I think that's so appropriate because the kings of Israel were a bunch of turkeys. They were. All of the kings of Israel were bad. They were evil, every one of them. The kingdom of Israel only lasted just over 200 years. Now, this is the northern kingdom I'm talking about, and you can see that better on your map. The northern kingdom, whose capital was Samaria, had 19 unrighteous kings. Every one of them was bad. And of those 19, 8 were assassinated. 3 were from the evil Omri dynasty. 5 were from the destructive Jehu dynasty. And 1 of them was even a vassal for their conquerors, the Assyrians. These were evil, evil men. When you go through your study to make it simplified for yourself, every time you come across a king of Israel, highlight him in blue, because he made God so blue. He made God so sad. Highlight him in blue, and when you do it, highlight the verse you will see right behind it that says, all of these kings did evil in the sight of the Lord and followed in the sins of Jeroboam. Every one of their reigns was marked with unrest, blood, war, evil, and idolatry. They were sad and unrestful times. So finally, at 2 Kings 17:18, God says this: He was so angry with Israel that he removed them from his sight. Isn't that sad? The Assyrians, by God's hand, were allowed to come in and conquer Israel and deported them, exiled them in 722 BC. And they were scattered, all 10 tribes, scattered, never to return again. Never to return again. And these were people. These were mamas being ripped from their children. These were husbands and sons and cousins and aunts and uncles being killed, annihilated, trampled, and taken away. And the Assyrians were ruthless. They were a ruthless, cruel conqueror. They were known for doing 3 things to their captors so that everyone would be intimidated by them. Every other country would be afraid of them. They would impale the leaders of the city that they conquered. Do you know what impaling is? That is like shish kebabbing a human being. It is driving the stake through their body, uprighting it, and leaving them to die that way. Then they would go through the city that they had just destroyed and gather heads. They would mutilate the bodies of the dead. And they would put piles of heads outside the city as a monument to themselves, to their own cruelty. And then, for those who survived, they were not any more fortunate than those who died, because they were taken away not just in chains, but in hooks through their faces. This is devastation. This is death, and this is destruction. And that's what happens with evil leadership. So these evil kings who led their people in Baal worship and the worship of golden calves also led their people straight into captivity, into exile. The thing about exile is when you are exiled from God, you are in captivity to something else. And it's always cruel. We never see them again. Now, the second kingdom doesn't do much better. They do a little bit better. The kingdom of Judah. They actually have 20 kings. That's the southern kingdom, and the capital is Jerusalem, and it's only made up of 2 tribes. It's only 2 tribes of Israel. Now, out of those 20 kings, 8 of them were good. Well, 9 if you count Asa from 1 Kings, but we're only studying 8. There were only 8 good kings, and the verse that I want you to highlight in gold, and I'm going to tell you why they get gold. Because Judah is the line preserved by God. Judah is the line of David. And God protects it. So whenever you see the king of Judah, highlight that one in gold and highlight this verse with it. The kings who did right in the sight of the Lord did according to all their father David had done. It's pretty easy to find them since you're only going to find 8. But they're Jehoshaphat, Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, Jotham, Hezekiah, and Josiah. The sad part is there's a tag on every one of those verses that says However, they did not remove the high places, and the people still worshiped and sacrificed there. These kings were still leading the people in idolatry. And you know that as the leader goes, so go the people. And in 2 Kings 24:20, this is what God does. The anger of the Lord came about in Jerusalem and Judah, and he cast them from his presence. He allowed the Babylonians to come in and exile the entire kingdom of Judah. And that was in 586 BC. And they were exiled for 70 years. 70 years. The two tribes will return. The remnant will return, but they will be gone for 70 years. And in that exile, again, thousands of people went, and they took the best and the brightest with them, but they will be allowed to return. Where the Assyrians never let their captors return, the 10 tribes stayed scattered forever. These folks will come back. So the truth is, 2 Kings does end on a hopeful note. In chapter 7, the very, very, very last chapter of the whole book, you're going to see that King Jehoiachin, one of the kings of Judah, is released. And after his release, generations go by, and Zerubbabel brings back the remnant. The remnant returns. There are no more earthly kings in Israel, but there is a heavenly, eternal king. Oh, shouldn't we listen to his word, obey his command, heed his warnings, so that we are not exiled from his presence, or as the Bible says, from his sight. Because if we are, we're captive to something else. There are a couple kings I want to mention today. And those are Joash and Josiah. They were both child kings. Joash was in 835 BC. He was actually protected from the evil daughter of Jezebel and Ahab. She tried to destroy the line of King David, but God protected this little baby through the high priest. And this little boy was crowned at age 7, and he brought about a huge revival, rebuilt the temple, got people to make offerings to keep the house of God a treasure place. But when he got older, he got prideful. And that same high priest, after he died, his son came to confront him one day. His name was Zechariah. And he confronted him, and Joash had him killed. And the people rallied and had him assassinated. Pride brought his destruction. Josiah was also a child king. When he started reigning, he was 8 years old, and he pretty much did the same thing. Brought about a revival, reinstituted the feasts. He was the one that said, love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. But pride got the best of him and led to his destruction. He went and picked a war with Pharaoh Necho, who God said, do not fight him. But he ignored the warning, and he went and fought him anyway. Even Pharaoh Necho said, don't fight me. You're not going to win. Your God doesn't want you to fight me. And he did it anyway, ignored God's warning, and he died. Another guy I want you to look at closely is Hezekiah. His reign was in 715. Hezekiah is a picture of the on-again, off-again, compromise, semi-committed person. He started strong at age 25 and cleaned up the whole nation. Then he made a deal with Assyria. He made a deal with the enemy, or as we would say, with the devil. Then he got recommitted, and he had Isaiah come in and guide him, and he laid himself out before the Lord, and the Lord provided a miraculous victory. Read about it. It will awe you. And then he finds himself sick, and he cries out to God, please, please don't let me die like this. And Isaiah comes back and says, God's going to give you 15 more years. And in those 15 years, he did a good thing. Matter of fact, he collected a bunch of people and compiled part of the book of Proverbs. But his pride got the best of him. And when the Babylonians came to visit, he showed off all his treasures. And Isaiah came and said, your pride and arrogance is the end of not only you, but these people. The Babylonians will now take all of us into captivity in the future. And that's what happened. He sealed the deal for their exile, for their captors. And then the last one I want to mention is Manasseh. When you first read this, you're going to go, why did she list Manasseh? I'm going to tell you why. He ruled in 697, and he started poorly. And poorly would be the understatement of the year. He was into witchcraft, sorcery, divination. He even made his children pass through fire. He sacrificed them to other gods. And yet, oddly enough, God used the Assyrian army to come and take him away, and he experienced exile. And remember how painful that was. He not only experienced it, he experienced it with all of his senses. With his sight, with sound, he could smell it, he could taste it. He was actually hooked and taken away. And it was there in captivity when he realized how far he really was from God. And he called out and he repented. And God heard him and he restored him. And he brought him back to Judah and let him finish his reign. And he finished it as a godly king and leader. He finished well, and he started so poorly. I wanted to mention Manasseh because that's my story. That is my story. And the first time I read it, I was brought to tears. I was one of the leaders of the world, and I mean like the evil world, my own little world. And the people that followed behind me followed right in those evil footsteps. I even helped a woman sacrifice her child to the god of this world. She came to me wanting to know what to do about her pregnancy, and she wasn't married. And I led her to an abortion clinic. Sacrificed a baby like Manasseh. When I read this story, I knew if I went to God and repented even of that, He could restore me. If He did it for him, He can do it for me. The true King, the Prince of Peace, the one who wore this, the King who wants only the best for us. And not just for us, but for those who follow us. Because as the leader goes, so go the people. Who are you leading? Who is following you? And where are you taking them?
He formed the man, and watch this, He breathed into him the breath of life.
This book is immensely important for you to understand the rest of the Bible.
It pictures the promised Messiah. It tells us about God's desire to dwell among us. Imagine that.
The book of Numbers is always getting a bad rap. The truth is, I'm going to tell you right now, it's an interesting book. But this is the first time God's actually said, I love you.
You choose today. You choose today who you're going to serve.
Judges in the Hebrew language means ruler, deliverer, savior. They delivered and they liberated.
He lets her sit at his table. He feeds her, he serves her, and he finds out that she is, in fact, a woman of integrity.
If you like biographies, you're going to love this book because it's the story of three men.
So if you're wondering where in the world you're going to find this reign of David, or where you hear people talking about David, you will know for certain. If you want to know about David as king, it is going to be in 2 Samuel.
Fear brings division in our relationship with God. What fear is causing you to have a problem today?
1 and 2 Kings is from man's perspective.